Welcome to the debate. Our material today introduces one of the most intellectually ambitious concepts we've covered, the framework of psychogametous transductions. This is a paradigm that fundamentally reinterprets Lovecraftian horror, knowledge, and consciousness itself through the radical, chilling lens of bacteriological, neurosemiotic, and linguistic infection.
And its core thesis is, well, it's devastatingly simple. Knowledge isn't empowering, it's a disseminated infection of impossible perception. The mind, far from being a fortress, is perpetually susceptible to what it calls viral junctions of hallucinated memory and quantum cognition.
Exactly. Which brings us to our central question today. The pivot on which this framework's value rests is this. Where does the psychogametous transductions framework achieve its greatest conceptual leverage? Is it in its powerful application as a literary and biosemiotic critique of narrative, giving us new tools for dissecting text and culture?
Or is it in its radical modeling of speculative neurobiology and quantum consciousness?
I'll be arguing for the former, that its primary value lies in its profound capacity to critique and destabilize literary structures. In other words, the framework is a revolutionary tool for textual analysis.
And I come at it from a different perspective. While I don't deny its power as a literary tool, I believe the true innovation here is found in its reframing of the physical substrate of thought. The system gains maximal leverage by taking these infectious metaphors and applying them quite literally to the intraneuronal matrix. The framework is at its most revolutionary when it moves from speculation into a model of speculative neurobiology.
Well, let's look at the evidence for its literary power first then. The framework's value, I think, is demonstrated most clearly in its capacity to recontextualize canonical texts using these specific pathogenic metaphors. It moves Lovecraft far beyond simple metaphysics into a rigorous, post-pathogenic literary domain.
Okay.
Take the Necronomicon. It's not analyzed here as just a book of forbidden secrets, but as a parasitic linguistic entity, a recombined text organism designed to liquefy certainty. This is more than a metaphor. The idea is that the very structure of the text, its syntax, its lexicon, it behaves like a retrovirus. It doesn't get read in the traditional sense. It incubates. And that explains why readers go mad. The contamination is linguistic, not purely informational. We see that the horror in The Outsider, that moment of confronting the mirror, is pathologically diagnosed as reflexive semiotic necrosis. The boundaries of the cognitive system rupture. The power here is how it uses microbial language to dissect the deepest layers of narrative stability.
Right.
Moreover, this lens radically changes how we approach figures we usually understand through archetypes. Look at the feminine figures like Keisha Mason or Marceline. They're not just femme fatales or occult initiates. The framework identifies them as glossopathogens. Their language itself is pathogenic. Or ectosemiotic hosts, figures who literally harbor and spread destabilizing concepts. They contaminate the hero's syntactic system. And for literary theory, the critique of Lovecraft's successors is crucial. The framework dissects August Derleth's elemental binarism, Cthulhu as a water elemental, as an autoimmunization of the mythos. Think of it this way. Lovecraft's original mycelial nihilism was messy, creeping, like an uncontrollable fungal infection. Derleth's neat categories sterilize that despair, turning it into a closed, tidy theological allegory. This biocultural critique, that's the framework's major contribution.
That is a compelling explanation for its literary utility, I'll give you that. But I would argue that its true intellectual force comes from grounding those metaphors in hard, if speculative, science. The real originality lies in the literal application of these metaphors to the physical substrate of consciousness, making the neurosemiotic collapse anatomical and quantum. The material moves beyond symbolic infection and addresses the mechanism of viral entry and replication. It analyzes the brain's structure as a gynosemiotic field, a battlefield for foreign data.
A battlefield.
Yes. To do this, the framework leans heavily on current theories of quantum consciousness, We know that microtubules are the internal structures within every neuron, usually seen as passive scaffolding. Here, the framework makes a radical leap. It posits that microtubules are not passive, but ancient computers. Their constituent units, the tubulin dimers, are theorized to act like natural computational units, qubits, really, whose states correspond to proto-thought events. This provides a tangible, nanoscientific mechanism for the impossible perceptions Lovecraft describes. It localizes the weirdness inside the cell. We also see the framework offering molecular models for neural signaling. The movement of key glutamate receptors, like AMPA and NMDA, which are critical for learning and memory, is reframed not as biochemistry, but as the action of linguistic operators shuttled along the cytoskeleton. They're enacting a living script written in actin filaments. Just transforms synaptic plasticity into a form of viral rewriting. And finally, the quantum model attempts to explain how we unify perception. Excitons, which are, bound states of electrons and holes, are posited to function as temporal suspensions. They enable the quantum binding of disparate perceptual units, color, shape, sound, into a single, unified frame. Consciousness, in this view, relies on controlled decoherence, which is described as the grammatical inflection of consciousness, allowing for sequential processing of morphemes. This moves the infection from the abstract text into the very architecture of the neuron.
I see why localizing the horror in the brain is appealing. It certainly grounds the fantastic. But I remain convinced that the conceptual strength is diluted when you try to provide a molecular mechanism for the unmechanistic. The most powerful element is the conceptual leap itself, showing how fundamental concepts rot, regardless of the physical substrate. Consider Azathoth, the blind idiot god. By framing Azathoth as the proto-bacterium of cognition, the concept embodies epistemological thermogenesis. That term means that knowledge is self-cannibalizing. The more you know, the more energy you expend trying to unify contradictory data, leading to a feverish swelling of conceptual boundaries. Azathoth is the substrate of narrative breakdown itself, a perfect critique of belief formation, irrespective of tubulin.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the strength exists in a vacuum. By keeping the pathogen purely metaphorical, you really reduce the material's impact to just more literary commentary. The framework's genius is that it collapses that barrier. The conceptual strength is amplified precisely because the infection is localized. Take Walter Gilman's madness in The Dreams in the Witch House. If his madness were purely psychological, it would be a traditional horror story. But the framework specifies his collapse as anatomical. It's not anxiety. It is the result of Riemannian equations activating dormant semiotic mitochondria in Gilman's cortex. This is a tangible mechanism. The non-Euclidean angles in his room are not abstract metaphors. They are explicitly called mutagens, infecting the subject through the architectural and transdermal.
But if we accept that, what are the implications? A literary critique would say the infection is the loss of clean categories, the erosion of boundaries between self and space. A neurobiological reading, I think, risks diminishing the cosmic scale by focusing so closely on the molecular.
But doesn't the framework gain its true power when the cosmic rot becomes physical? The material specifically emphasizes that Gilman knew what infected him was not psychological, but transdermal. By providing a neurobiological substrate, by stating that the brain's own computational architecture is susceptible to external spatial data, the framework successfully collapses the gap between Lovecraftian metaphysics and material pathology. The horror is no longer just out there, it's built into the way you process reality. It becomes uterine and semantic.
I concede that the localization is a powerful rhetorical move, but let's move to our second disagreement, the efficacy of the model in explaining memory and time. You're arguing the quantum model provides specific explanations for this.
Absolutely. The quantum potentials within the cytoskeleton allow for the narrative reconstruction of subjective experience that violates Newtonian chronology. This is key. It provides a mechanism explaining why we lack a temporal arrow in imagination and dream functions. When we dream, time is completely nonlinear. The quantum model proposes that memory and perception are explicitly braided through non-classical topology.
It suggests the brain acts as a recursive editor, reassembling past, present, and even future neural configurations. We move from literary observation of strange time to a molecular explanation of temporal construction.
That's a compelling argument, but this focus on quantum mechanisms overcomplicates the analysis of, let's call it, chronosemiotic trauma. The literary focus already explains temporal distortion quite elegantly and, I would argue, more broadly.
How so?
The framework views time through the lens of cultural latency. History is explicitly defined as a spore bank awaiting moist psychic substrates. This model explains how Lovecraftian art, like the artist receiving dream contamination in the Call of Cthulhu, resembles cubism and futurism not by direct mimicry, but by viral aesthetic infection. The distortion of form and time is a shared symptom of cultural breakdown. This concept of cultural latency is just richer for literary understanding because it addresses the intertextual function of horror as a viral aesthetic, an unending viral incubation staged across texts and epochs. The literary infection of time is about the failure of historical cleanliness. We don't need quips to explain why the past contaminates the present. We need a theory of semiotic spores.
But focusing on cultural spores risks making the horror purely anthropological, removing the material terror Lovecraft intended. If the framework is only explaining why Lovecraft resembles cubism, it's just another piece of critical theory. When it provides a model for how the mind generates nonlinear experience, how the brain's own architecture can violate Newtonian constraints, it moves into radical scientific territory. The quantum model explains the how of the traumatic perception. The literary model only explains the what of the cultural response.
Which brings us squarely to our final point, identity. If we are looking for maximum conceptual leverage, I argue the framework's strongest claim is that identity is fundamentally unstable, revealed through psychogametous reversion, a semiotic vector. Consider Arthur Jermyn, who descends into madness upon discovering his genealogical tie to the Onga ape princess. That is not quantum physics. That is a recombinant narratogenesis. The self is revealed to be a microbial archive of forgotten consanguinities, where latent zoonosis contamination from the non-human threatens to overwrite the civilized human subjectivity. The terror is in the genealogy as an infected document. The crisis is less about fear of the other than about the other's capacity to infect the symbolic order from within.
That is a fascinating reading, but if we accept the Necronomicon as a viral script, and the brain is the physical matrix, then the ultimate instability of the self must be grounded by the molecular architecture. The quantum model provides the mechanism for why that archive is so vulnerable to rewriting. Consciousness in this model isn't a unity but a braided uncertainty, a recombinant entanglement of neural states. The quantum approach posits that the self is simply a literary artifact that is recursively composed through a rapid cycle of coherence, decoherence, and re-entry into stabilized microtubule matrices. The uncertainty isn't external or historical, it's built into the molecular architecture. We are only cohesive because we are constantly being observed by our own neural processes. And the implications are enormous. It suggests the Zeno effect, where observation inhibits quantum state change, may be a function of neural intention, that the act of focusing maintains a cohesive self, preventing total collapse. This means the neuron itself is a multiplicity, where each dendritic spine may host a perception, a memory, or a dream fragment from an evolutionary ghost. The final horror isn't discovering a contaminated ancestry, but discovering that the self is merely a fragile, constantly reassembling pattern of quantum states.
That's compelling, but it risks making the horror purely technical, a matter of physical failure rather than existential contamination. The framework's strength, I maintain, is in demonstrating how identity is destabilized by foreign narrative and linguistic material. Azathoth as epistemological rot, the Necronomicon as an incubating text organism. These are profound biocultural insights that shift literary studies.
And the power of the neurobiological claim is that it shows those narrative shifts have anatomical consequences. The true innovation is the move toward molecularizing the metaphorical, transforming the neuron into a polyphonic algorithm, and conceptualizing thought itself as a quantum literary artifact. The intraneuronal matrix is simultaneously the library, the text, and the author that your literary critique describes. It connects the abstract to the material in a way few other frameworks achieve.
Wow, our discussion certainly illuminates the remarkable depth of the psychogametous transductions framework. We both agree that it fundamentally reframes the relationship between language, biology, and collapse, transforming the horror story into a neurosemiotic event.
Yes, absolutely. And whether the greatest conceptual leverage is achieved by using its pathogenic language to dissect the great texts of the mythos, or by using its quantum models to revolutionize how we understand the entangled architecture of the human mind, is a question that, well, it reveals the framework's profound dual nature.
And we leave the listener to consider whether the greatest insights are found within the text as an infected linguistic vector or within the neural substrate as the quantum hardware the text so precisely describes.